In its classic form, it looked like this. This is in Antwerp, where you have a densely populated urban district near the center. This is right near the train station, where people from all over the world take advantage of the low price of housing in a district and use it for their to make their start. They form clusters of people from the same villages. They loan each other money. They set up shops. They in English-speaking countries, they use the rising value of housing that they've probably purchased eventually in order to finance those things. Not done as much in continental Europe and so on. And they attempt to build links into existing urban education systems, employment systems, small business systems, and political systems in order to further their advancement and so on. And classic places that have followed that pattern, the Lower East Side of New York City, that has seen probably about 15 different immigrant groups from, 4 major religions, all go from being mud floor peasants into very successful middle class people through its borders. Belleville in Paris, which similarly saw multiple different groups from multiple different places use its lower cost of housing in order to propel themselves into success. Kensington Market in Toronto, here in the 20th century, when it was largely an Eastern European Jewish ghetto full of illiterate people from very poor backgrounds who used it to leverage themselves into the middle class. And then later on in the 80s, here when I lived there, same corner, people from the Pearl River region of China, and then from Vietnam, from, again, very poor places who used its easy small business access, its cheap housing in order to build both what you call social equity and also actual equity for themselves. So these type of districts were tended to have all the things a new immigrant needs to build a successful platform for success. They had the cheap housing and therefore low rent. They had a high population density and high intensity, so there was a lot of stuff going on, which they had informal zoning, which meant that nobody was really bothered if you wanted to open a shop or a restaurant or even a small factory within your housing unit. And because of that intensity and density, it meant that if you opened a shop or a restaurant or something, you had lots of people with money walking past and driving past who were going to spend it there and were going to turn your business into a success, so it would propel you into the next level of success. You had not just a bottom rung on the ladder, but the next couple rungs above were there in place as well. And as well, we had an industrial economy which provided easier forms of lifetime employment and so on. So we had a combination of factors that were ideal. And that era has now ended. The people arriving now are not able to get that housing. Sorry, let's just go through. Let's go through what people did in those neighborhoods. They would use their housing to start a shop like this. The collapse of the industrial economies occurred during the time that people were moving into these arrival city districts. And the collapse of the industrial economies allowed people to use their poor immigrant neighborhoods as the main vehicles for their success. I look at the Bangladeshis of London a lot, who arrived as factory workers shortly before the British industrial economy collapsed. They had about a decade and a half, 2 decades of poverty, misery, disease, extremism. Their neighborhoods became very disreputable and so on, before sort of latching onto business opportunities. And as much as it's an ethnic stereotype, the curry house became a major part of that. The easy ability to open a business within your residential neighborhood became a platform for success for many people in these places. And what did they do with this? They opened businesses like this. They used the revenues to send money back in large volumes to where they came from. This is a village a very poor rice farming village in Sylhet in northern Bangladesh that I visited a few years ago, where you found scattered among the rice paddies and shacks a number of really palatial houses like this that were built using the 50 quid a week sent back from the people who ran those small businesses in London. In fact, this particular house here, which I found after I'd walked across a mud path between rice paddies for about half an hour, I said to them, well, where's your money coming from? And they showed me a picture, and it was of this particular curry house, which happened to be in my neighborhood in North London, happened to be the closest curry house to my actual house. Actually, not a very good restaurant at all, but I was pleased to see that it was supporting this level of success there. So the largest share of rural development in the world, and in fact of economic development in the world, is caused by these remittances sent from people in arrival city districts, from places like Surrey to rural areas. That exceeds all the world's foreign aid combined by a factor of 10 or 20 or something like that. In countries like Bangladesh, it often exceeds all the revenue from the garment industry and things like this. It's a major part of the world economy, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that urban districts like this are central to the development of modernization of rural areas around the world. But again, these inner city, arrival city districts are coming to an end. And let me explain why by explaining my own role in the destruction of the Western arrival city. Because I think I'm like a lot of people in that I'm part of a middle class who decided it was a good idea to live in the central cities, in part because those waves of post-war immigrants had made them into appealing places to live with good markets and butchers and places to eat and that sort of thing. So I've always lived in central Toronto. I grew up among people from Guangdong and from Abruzza and from rural parts of Portugal and Greece and so on, who'd come from mud floor villages into areas like this. And I've always recognized these as appealing places. So in the 90s, I bought my first house in Toronto, which was a little narrow semi-detached house that had, when I bought it, had 3 kitchens in it, which means that 3 families of poor migrants had been living in this tiny little house, none of it legal. And which of course I turned into a single family house. And then this year I bought this slightly larger little narrow house, which in fact when I bought it had 4 kitchens in it. Which of course I'm removing them all and turning it into a single family house for the 4 of us, which means that in the last 15 or 17 years, I have displaced 7 poor rural-born immigrant families with 1 4-person middle-class families. Now, what have I done? What have I done? From one perspective, I have propelled 7 families, and in fact more than that, because the matriarch who owned this house divided the revenues from its sale among her daughters. So perhaps a dozen working class poor immigrant families into the middle class by giving them enough money to put the down payment on a house in the suburbs. And so I'm a great social platform of social mobility. Thank you. And on the other hand, what I have done is I have rendered districts like this. This is Christie Pitts in Toronto, which was a great Jewish arrival city, and then was a great Portuguese and Italian arrival city, and into places that could never again be an arrival city, that no poor immigrant from a rural area could ever think of not even renting a place in or buying a place. And I'm part of a pattern that exists across most North American and European cities, a few exceptions such as Leeds and Detroit. But for the most part, there is no place in the old high-density established urban core for the poor rural-born immigrant. Where do people immigrate now? They increasingly wind up in places that look like this. The inner suburbs, sometimes the outer suburbs, are now the main site of immigration in almost all North American and European cities. In Canada, almost all immigration now is to the suburbs, as I don't need to tell anyone in Vancouver. I would say that probably the largest recipient the largest settlement point for immigrants in North America is Peel region outside of Toronto. That's Mississauga and Brampton and all that, although Los Angeles' suburbs come close. Although if you included Surrey and Richmond as one place, they would come second probably. Most of these places were built and designed and planned in the post-war decades as being excellent places for people who wanted to move out of cities, out of the crowded downtown core and so on. The imagined use for places like this was that people from the crowded downtown in the working class would want to move into these places and so on. And almost from the beginning, they've been used for almost exactly the opposite purpose, which is people coming from someplace outside of the country, arriving there and settling there with the ambition of getting themselves into the downtown core, or at least its economy and economic system and so on. And these places are almost ideally, perfectly suited for the failure of immigrant success in many ways. They were built with big grassy areas between the buildings, with long windy streets, with big parks separating them from any big population areas, and with strict land use zoning separating residential and retail and industrial into very physically separate places. And it was almost a recipe for failure for the immigrant story. It prevented people from doing any of the new immigrant stuff that people like to do. If you settle in a building like that, you want to open, first of all, you probably can't buy it. Second of all, you want to open a small shop there. There's no physical space to do it, and there are probably rules that prevent you from doing it. And even if you did do it, you wouldn't have any traffic coming by. You wouldn't have people walking by on the street. You wouldn't have people driving around to go shopping and so on, so that wouldn't succeed. You're probably located physically quite a distance from the place where you work when you get yourself a job. So you perhaps have a 2-hour bus ride to get to your job each way. And during those 4 hours, no surprise if your children are using that empty space between the buildings as their main form of childcare, and hey, they join a gang and something bad happens, and so on. And the physical separation and the lack of engagement between places like this and the established urban economy means that in this case, as you can see by those satellite dishes studying the building, it's easier for the people who live there to remain in contact with the place they came from and its language than with the actual city that they live in. It's easy to connect by satellite to the place you came from than it is to connect in any physical or economic way to the place where you're actually living now, even if your ambition was the other way around. Now, this particular place is a place I've written about called Slotervaart on the outskirts of Amsterdam, which is largely a Moroccan and Turkish arrival city now, and it ran into horrific problems of gang crime, extremism. The guy who shot that filmmaker and caused a decade of political crisis came from one of these buildings and so on. It became a crisis point that was widely recognized as a failure in every way. And it's worth looking at what happens when that occurs. And it's important to realize that there are things that people in planning and design can do to help prevent these things from happening, and also to turn around places like this when these things happen. And I think the mindset you need to get into is one where you think of those dotted lines. The people coming from the places into these neighborhoods do not imagine themselves being stuck in intergenerational poverty and extremism and so on. Nobody makes that voyage with that ambition. Nobody wants to just sit around. And if people end up in that situation, it's because some barrier has been placed in the way of the initial dotted line that they had in mind. And it's worth studying what that barrier is. And in this case, they did a very interesting thing. The housing cooperatives that run these big public housing projects in Amsterdam decided that the built form of this district was a big part of the problem, as I pointed out. What was funneling people into bad situations had a lot to do with what type of neighborhood it was. And they said they raised some money and they bulldozed down a lot of these buildings, and they replaced them with this, which they essentially looked at the places I showed you earlier where poor immigrants had turned themselves into middle-class people. And they said, what is it about these places that we can imitate? Let's create a place like that, like the Lower East Side, like Lower Spadina Avenue in Toronto, like Whitechapel Spitalfields in London, and let's reproduce its form here. So 8 to 11-story buildings placed close together on a tight grid with a very high population density, with easy road access to the shops and so on. Pathways to ownership of the apartments and so on. There's parks and playgrounds and so on behind them. It's not completely barren, but it's a more tight-knit feeling. And with the bottom 2 floors of buildings occupied by spaces that could be used for anything industrial or retail or what have you, without much control, a sense of ownership of the street outside, a sense of attraction of foot traffic, and incentives designed to get, this is right after this place was built, to get people there to open small businesses and to engage in entrepreneurship, a loosening of licensing requirements, and so on. Very hard to get people in that part of Europe to understand that you can lower the hygiene rules, you can lower the business licensing requirements and create beneficial patterns, and so on. There's a lot of mindsets to get around. In Belgium, where I've done a lot of work in their cities, to start even a small corner shop or something like that, you have to get yourself a business diploma that takes 1 year of education and so on. Inaccessible. So the basic new immigrant thing becomes unattainable. So this is a way to try to get around that. And they created incentives for people from the established population of central Amsterdam to want to go in there and set up high-tech companies, to set up artistic and creative businesses and so on. In other words, they tried to create a place that the yuppies wanted to move into because of an understanding that having that social mix of established people and newcomers, of middle-class people and people from lower income brackets creates positive incentives. It creates virtuous cycles. It creates consumer markets for the stuff that the immigrants are selling. It also finances the development, because if some of the housing in these developments is sold for $400,000, I mean, a big part of improving failed immigrant districts is increasing the population density. Low population density is the enemy of social mobility. And so they're tripling the number of people per square kilometer. Some of those people can be paying a lot of money for their housing, which creates both a middle class who are going to buy your stuff, but it also finances the development. Now, those sort of value capture ways of redeveloping social housing, they never quite pay for themselves. I mean, the sale of apartment units never quite completely pays for it, but it does have other beneficial effects. And we've seen that done in some Canadian housing developments. The Regent Park redevelopment in Toronto was successfully done that way, to create a social mix and a higher density at the same time. I mean, I now take my kids swimming in Regent Park because it has a great swimming pool in the middle and it's a nice neighborhood to walk around. And when I lived next door to it in the 80s, I wouldn't have walked through it myself. Say nothing of children. Higher population density creates feeling of security as well, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment. So that was one situation where they recognized that built form was the solution. But sometimes it's other things. Sometimes when I look at what makes an arrival city district fail, you often have to ask what made it an arrival city district in the first place. I mean, what is the definition of what I call an arrival city? It's a place in an urban area where the housing costs are for some reason considerably lower than anywhere else in the city, so that an immigrant from a country with a lower per capita income could conceivably afford to live there. That's what makes it an arrival city, and that's often what will later make it fail as an arrival city. That's what makes it the bottom rung on the ladder, and that whatever made it the bottom rung will often make it not have the second or third rungs present, unless we got lucky like we did the last 50 years. What would make a place have a lower cost than somewhere else? Sometimes it's just unfashionable, like those downtown districts were in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Sometimes it's cantilevered up and down the side of a cliff, like the favelas of Brazil. Sometimes it's built on the edge of a sewage lagoon or international airport. But sometimes it's just far away from the city. And that's often the case. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, some fairly enlightened governments and planners and so on recognized that one of the reasons why some of their favelas were failing once they got the drug gangs out and all that, and were still having troubles, was because they were really far away from the city. People were trying to start up small businesses, but you start up your ice cream shop and nobody's going to come from another part of Sao Paulo to get your famous ice cream if it takes you an hour to get there and so on. So they made a concerted effort to put regular bus routes into these deprived districts. That was all it took, linked to hub high-speed trains and so on. And I can tell you that the districts that got the regular bus service were transformed. Small businesses succeeded. People sought legitimate employment rather than gray market employment. People found it beneficial to actually have legitimate work rather than joining a gang or something like that. A bus made a huge difference. And we've seen that, I've seen that in districts on the outskirts of Madrid and Amsterdam as well, where the introduction of a high-speed train service turns into a situation of intergenerational poverty into a place of social mobility. Maybe not completely by itself, but it can be a major factor in contributing. And we saw in Rio, where they're spending gobs of money to try to turn around their rival city districts, their favelas, because they're hosting the two largest sports events in the world. We see them doing things like putting tramways like this one to get to the access of these very steep places. And so on. I mean, often transportation planning plays a very big part in turning places like this around. And Wi-Fi. The introduction, the people who live at the very bottom of the income pyramid need information technology more than anyone else now. The cheap laptop and the mobile phone have changed the lives in the poorest neighborhoods dramatically, and access to them. The young people know how to use access to these technologies to get themselves entrepreneurial opportunities and to make it. And very often the introduction of plain old cheap bandwidth can make a huge difference as well. Sometimes the high-speed bus route is important, but sometimes the high-speed internet connection is important as well, given the way that employment and business opportunities work in the new informal post-industrial economies.